Oftentimes you need to display data in a graphic level. That is, you need to put it into a chart. So to do this, we are going to be using something called Chart.js. This is a JavaScript library that allows you to do exactly that. It takes in some data and it displays it in a more interactive way than just the raw data itself. Now, there's a lot of different ways you can go about using Chart.js. So we're going to let you experiment with the documentation for the most part when it comes to displaying your data. But to get us to display data, especially inside of our Django projects, we need to see how that actually is set up. So we're going to be using Django and Chart.js to get this one started. So what I'm going to assume is you've already done some Django stuff. That is, you've gone on our YouTube channel and you've gone through at least the Try Django series. You don't have to go through all of these series, but at least you go through one of them and have a pretty good understanding of Django before you jump into this. If you don't, well, you might get really lost. This is also available on our website. That is codingforentrepreneurs.com/projects, or simply joincfe.com/projects. That will also bring you right into this website where we have all of our Try Django stuff there, as well as this video. And then finally, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be using Bootstrap. Now, I've already set up Bootstrap and a bunch of other things on this project in particular because the setup process we don't really need to go through, especially if you've gone through Try Django series. The specific stuff to Chart.js we will absolutely go through. But if you want to get where we are right now, go to our GitHub, which is where our code will be for all of this. And it's github.com/codingforentrepreneurs/Django-chart.js. And you'll see this base project setup. If you click on that, that will actually take you to the code that we're starting with, which is what we're going to do in just a moment. So now what I want to do is actually set up Django to work with Chart.js. That is, I'm going to do Django first to have the data from Django, so then we can work in Chart.js to use that data. So to do this, let's go ahead and take a look at the base Django project itself. There's not a whole lot going on here. I do recommend that you explore it a little bit, but we do have something called base.js, which shows us that we have jQuery in there as well as bootstrap.min. jQuery is not required for Chart.js, so you actually can use it in other JavaScript sort of projects. But in this case, we do have jQuery because Bootstrap requires on it. And then CSS, also Bootstrap related stuff. As far as the base file itself, hopefully you are already very familiar with this, so we're not going to really go through that a whole lot. We already have a view set up, a home view that is going to render out our chart or our charts.html file, which if we look at that content itself is just hello world at this point. So that's really where we're going to be working in. Now, in order for this to work, we have to create a view that's going to give us our data. Now, this view can be done whether it's in Django itself, or it can also be done inside of using something like the Django REST framework. So let's go ahead and first off create our first view that's actually going to give us some data. And I'm going to use a function-based view. You can obviously reformat it to a class-based view just like this. But I'm going to go ahead and just say get data. And we're going to take in the request. And I'll just do args and keyword args. We probably don't need those even. But then we're going to return some sort of data. Now, normally you return what's called an HTTP response. That's what this does. But what we want to do is to return a JSON response. And to actually return a JSON response, there's old ways of doing it, and then the modern way of doing it, which is from Django.http import JSON response. Now, again, this is not the only way you can do it, but it's a shortcut to actually returning JSON data. JSON data is the JavaScript object notation. That's what it stands for. That's what JSON stands for. And that's what we can actually use inside of JavaScript. So our jQuery can actually call a URL that returns back some JavaScript, and then we can use that JavaScript. So let's just go ahead and say data equals to some dictionary here. So I'm going to give the dictionary of, let's say, for instance, sales, and I'll just say 100, and then we'll just say customers equals to 10. Okay, so some basic, very, very basic data. And inside of that response, I'm just going to return that. So notice it's returning just a dictionary. It's not much different than what's going on here, except JSON response is a response object itself. So it actually is an HTTP response, but with the data type of JSON. So let's go ahead and take a look at this. I'm going to wrap this URL into my URLs itself. So let's go ahead and import it. And then I'm going to just grab this here and I'll just say API data. Now the reason I'm saying API is because more than likely this will be an API endpoint, and then I'll use my function-based view here and I'll just do API data. So when I say more than likely it will be an API endpoint, meaning you'll likely use the Django REST framework for this, which is something we'll show you in just a moment, but you'll likely use that versus Django, built hard-coded Django itself. So your endpoint will look like an API data. So let's go ahead and go to this endpoint, and I'm going to run the local server, and I'll go to that endpoint. Let's make sure our server is running. Python manage.py, run server, refresh, and here's some data. Okay, so since I've got this data, this is actually in JSON format. So that means that on my home page, I can run through some of this data, or pretty much any page that I want, that I can grab that data. So the endpoint was, if you remember, so var endpoint equals to, and it's API data. So the reason I'm hard coding this is because if I ever wanted to pull out the jQuery or JavaScript stuff, I could, versus doing the Django stuff, which would be URL and then the URL name. So you could do it either way, but I'm going to be leaving it in hard coded. So again, that I don't have to have the JavaScript itself right inside of the HTML. That's sort of a practice that you want to get used to doing instead of hard coding or having the URLs come out themselves. If you do want to have the URLs, I would recommend putting them on something like URL-endpoint and then putting it into an actual div tag that the jQuery or the JavaScript would actually run off of. So that's just something to think about when it comes to designing this stuff. But now that we've got an endpoint, let's go ahead and use jQuery to get the actual data. So we're using Ajax here, and we'll do method equals to get. In our case, we aren't doing a post method. We're just getting data here. And then the URL is going to be equal to that endpoint. And then we'll say success. I don't need to pass in any data at all. I'm going to run in a function here, and we'll say data, and I'll just do console log data. And then if we have any errors, I'll go ahead and log those as well. And we'll just call this error data, and I'll console log error. Okay. So now we've got this Ajax call. This should actually work. If I refresh on this home page and look into the console, so we go to inspect into console, I see that it says object, and notice that I have this object stuff here. So this means that I can actually work with this data. So if I did console log customers, and customers would be 10. So let's do data, would be actually, sorry, data.customers. And let's go ahead and times it by 100, or let's say times it by some weird number there, 234. I refresh in here, it gives me that math. Okay, so this is because of our view here, right? This is actually returning that response inside of JSON data. Now, if I had it inside of this context here, so if I said customers and 10, right? If I did something like that, where it's actually being rendered from Django versus using an endpoint, I would come in charts, and instead of using the Ajax call, I would say var data equals to the context. I have to put it into a string. Okay, so now that I put it into a string, I can console log. Let's just call this customers under Django, and we'll console log customers Django. We'll save that. Refresh in here. Notice it says 10, but that's actually a string. So to turn that into an integer, we'll do parse int, which is built into jQuery, and we do parse int, and that gives us an actual number that now we can do %, times 234 or whatever we want to call it, and refresh, and now that actually works. So this is doing a very similar thing, but the nice part of having an endpoint or an API is that you're starting to think of your data differently, right? It's detaching where you're getting the data from where the data is being rendered. So this is the method that you want to go about doing it. Okay, so now that we've got how to do the data using built-in Django, let's do it using the Django REST framework really simply. And I'm going to just search Django REST framework, and I'm going to click on that. We're going to go to API guide and views, and we're going to just be using this generic API view. So I'll do some of these imports here, and then I'm going to go ahead and use the class-based view that it's already in there. Notice I did not take all of the imports. The authentication classes I'm going to just keep as an empty list. Permission classes also as an empty list. And I'll go ahead and get rid of some of these comments. And I'll get rid of this one. And I'll call this chart data. And notice it is a class-based view, so I'm going to go ahead and copy this. I'm going to bring it into my URLs. And now I'm going to go ahead and make another endpoint and call it chart/data. And we'll use chartdata.asView. And I'm not really going to worry about the URL name here. So I've got a new view for this chart data. In my settings, I might need to actually add in REST framework. Make sure that's working. And then let's go ahead and look at that endpoint, which was API chart data. And oops, we need to actually run that method. Let's try that again. And we got users not defined. Oops, so that's because of our views. So let's use that same data that we had inside of here, and I'll just call it data. And I'll tab this in. Response goes to data. Refresh in here, and here's the REST framework. This actually has that same data. So these two methods are the same. The biggest difference here is what you might notice is the authentication classes and permission classes. That is where you'd want to use the REST framework all the time, because this has a lot of built-in features to it that make actually getting the data based off of some authentication or permission. Now, we're not going to go into the REST framework here. We definitely cover it in the blog API project. So if you want to know more about the REST framework, that's where you would go about doing it. We do have a lot more in it than just that, so check out our website for that for more. But basically here, these three things are more or less giving us the same customer data, right? But all three of them have a different way about doing it. So which one's the best and which way are you going to want to go for? This right here. You're going to want to use the REST framework API view all the time when it comes to actually rendering this out. Now, of course, you can get into a lot more complicated stuff. And the main thing to think about here is you can also have a better way of showing this data in particular. That is, you can use query sets and render the data that way. So let's say, for instance, I went from Django.contrib.auth, import get user model, and we'll say user equals to get user model. I'm just going to show a basic query set here, and instead of on this chart data, I'll say users, and this get user.objects.all.count. This will actually give me an integer. This right here gives me an integer, so now we would be able to see that. So jumping back into there, I see that I have one user. So this obviously this data is based off of actual database information instead of hard-coded information here. So now we actually have a way to get that chart data. So going back in here, I'm going to just change my endpoint to chart data, which is the same as what we put here, right? So that URL is the same. I'm going to go ahead and get rid of the past data from Django itself, or the Django view, and we'll go back into that home view, refresh in there, and now we've got, the users, we've got all that JSON data actually coming through. Okay, cool. So now that we've got this data, it's time to actually work with Chart.js. So let's go ahead and jump into the documentation for Chart. Chart.js.org is where you're going to find it. We're going to click on Getting Started, and this is going to take us here. This is not what I wanted, actually, so let's go back into the documentation. and we will click, there's a few different options on how we can go about actually integrating this into our project. What I'm going to be doing is using the CDN version. Now, CDN versions mean Content Delivery Network, which is what we're already doing with some of our other stuff. So if I click on this, I'm just going to go ahead and do chart.min.js. If you want the unminified version, you can actually take a look at that. So you can actually read the code that's in there versus the minified version, you cannot read the code, or at least it's a lot harder to read the code. It's not made for humans. It's actually made for computers, so it loads a little faster. So I went ahead and copied that, and I went script source, and I'm just going to add this into my script, right? So into all my JavaScripts, I have all this stuff. So a CDN version just loads faster. As we see, Bootstrap, we've already done that, as well as jQuery. So when you use a CDN and you go to any site that is loading that same file, then when you go to your site and you're loading that file, it loads just a little bit faster, which is nice. It makes things go better. So now what we're going to do is actually run through the usage of this actual chart. So if we scroll down on the docs, down to just creating a chart, we can see some of the examples that they have built in. And since we already have our data, we can actually work off of our data set that we have. But I'm going to go ahead and copy their code first. So let's go ahead and copy this, and let's bring it into charts.html. And inside of our main content here, I'm going to just paste it in, and I'm just going to paste in all of that stuff with the exception of the script. I'm going to go ahead and cut that out for a moment, and I'm going to paste this inside of our block jQuery, get rid of this script tag as well as the top one, and then we'll tab this back. Okay, so it is inside of a jQuery call. It doesn't need to be, but it is. So we're going to go ahead and save that, and let's go ahead and look at our home page now. If I refresh in here, there we go. We've got a page, an actual chart that is rendered out for us. So if I change the size of the browser, I can actually see the chart and the data that's related to it. So all I need to do now is actually change the data set. So the data is right here, right? So that's actually an array or a list. In terms of Python, it's called a list. In JavaScript, it's called an array that has items in it, right? So we want to change those items to something in here. So something inside of this AJAX call, that is where we actually want to update our data. So let's go ahead and say var default data equals to just an empty array. So I'm going to take that empty array and I'm going to place it down here in data. We'll save that. I'll refresh in here. Notice all of the data goes away. Okay, so this, I also have labels. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this and say var labels equals to those labels. Okay, so these two items are the ones that we actually want to get from our view. So I'm going to go ahead and copy these and go back into my view, and I'll just say labels equals to that list. It's the same thing. So labels, and then we're going to say the data, or whatever the data is, are related to those labels. So let's go ahead and put labels here. I'm going to keep this also as an empty list. And then we'll do labels equals to data.labels. And then let's say default data equals to data.default data. And I'll just call it default. So data, of course, is the response. So this is really the response data here. So that's just something to keep in mind. So I'll go ahead and now also put in default as an argument to our view. So default being, well, we want it to be an array as well, or a list as well. So we'll say default items equals to. And what I'm going to do is actually say users first. And then I'll put that same query set count. So I'll cut this out and do QS count equals to that, or user count rather. And then I'll just use some arbitrary numbers for this other stuff. And of course, the labels are matching up. Like the number of labels are the same as the number of data items, or default items. Gonna get rid of that data. We save it, go back into our charts, and now we've got our default data. And this is where our chart is. So we're going to go ahead and save that. Let's go ahead and refresh in here. We actually don't have anything coming through, right? So it's not showing us the data. So it's not actually giving us what the chart should actually be. So I need to render this chart and load it based off of the new data. So let's go ahead and do that. We're going to move all of this data up. So I'm going to go ahead and cut. Well, let's actually think about the things that we can cut. So the background colors and the border colors, I don't necessarily need those. Like, you can change them if you'd like, but I'm not going to have them. Instead, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take the data sets and the context, and I'm going to put it inside of this success call. So we'll tab this over, and we're going to close off the data set, close off the data, and then close off the context. So that's going to be our new chart. And this other stuff, I'm going to go ahead and just comment those out. So here's my very basic data. Labels, data, labeled, number of votes, whatever that means. We don't need to worry about that. I refresh in here, and now we've got a little bit of an error. So let's go ahead and take a look at what the error is. It looks like actually calling this is not correct. So this closes off that data. This closes off the context that's being passed. And I need a parentheses here. There we go. Save that, refresh, and there is our new data. Okay, so notice how this data is actually coming through. So this one, it says thousands of votes, right? Users, there's literally one. So it shows us one vote and all that. So let's actually change that data inside of our views. Let's change it to just smaller numbers in general. So we save that, refresh, and now our data is a little bit more manageable as far as how it looks. The colors went away because we got rid of them inside of that call, but that is it. That's essentially how you will go about getting the data and then setting the data. You can set it in the success call, or what you could do is actually make a function. So we'll just say function set chart. And inside of here, I'm just going to cut that stuff back out. And that function of set chart would be called on the success call because we're setting that default data there, and then it's being used down there. So now we refresh in here. It's still the same stuff. So then in here, you can actually go back and bring back all of this stuff. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm just going to, actually, I'll just copy that whole thing and cut it out actually, and paste it inside of this function and uncomment it out. Save that, and we refresh in here, and there, now our colors are back and it's looking a little bit better. So as far as changing how this chart works, you can come in and just like kind of click on the different ones. So we've got type line. So let's change this to a line, and we've got type here. Let's just call it line. Let's go refresh in here, and now it's a line chart. Right? Let's go ahead and look at the next one. Of course, there's a lot more customization to this, but we've already done bar. Let's say polar area chart, something like this. I'm going to go ahead and just change the type to polar area. And there's the type right here, polar area. Save that. And let's look at that example. There we go. Right? So you can actually play around with these charts quite a bit. So the other part of this is if you wanted multiple charts, right? So to do this, you would basically pick the document or where you want to put it, right? So by default, we have this canvas of my chart right here. If I paste that, and we'll just say my chart number 2, I could go about doing that by saying my context here, chart number 2, and then I context or CTX for chart right there. I'm going to go ahead and copy this and have one of them being chart 2, and this is going to be a bar. We save that, a refresh, and if I scroll below it, I see that this same data is being displayed 2 times. So let's go ahead and make this just a little bit better on as far as seeing. So we'll do div class equals column small 6. And there we go. Close that off, save it, refresh in here, and now we've got our charts back to back next to each other that's showing how this is working. And it's also responsive. So it's actually changing with Bootstrap, which is really cool. So that's really useful as far as showing this data and playing around with it in a way that, might work for your project. So if you have any questions on what we did here, let us know. What I do encourage you with Chart.js itself is to just play around with it. I mean, all of these different options, it shows you the different options that you can really just kind of adjust, and that's how you'll kind of pick it up. There's definitely a lot to cover here. So if you want to know more about Chart.js, please let us know at joincfe.com/suggest. Please add it and upvote there if you really want to know more about Chart.js. But I think they have so many examples on here that it's fairly straightforward on getting all of these different things going. And the two sort of things that I would focus on are the labels and then the data. So the table that would be correlated to any given label. So something that could be a little bit more advanced would be like month by month. And then also like how the sales were for those months, or the viewership or whatever. So that's another thing to kind of think about when it comes to actually creating this data in particular. I know it's a little bit of a longer one, but we actually covered a ton of information. So hopefully you guys like this. If you did, please consider subscribing on YouTube. That's joincfe.com/YouTube, and also joining us on just joincfe.com. And that covers a lot more stuff that we like to teach you so you can get into action right away and launch those projects. Thanks again for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.